I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, a democracy in a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, and to defend it against all enemies. Father, as we gather here together in this classroom, we ask that you guide our studies and lead us to understanding. We also ask that you protect the individuality of each student as they question and ponder your word in these matters. Thank you, Father, for this beautiful place of learning. We pray these words in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, welcome back to Bridge Academy. This is Ms. Krewalt, and we're going to start Lesson 4 of Unit 2 in American Government. We're going to be discussing the American Abolitionist movement. This effort really brings out that proving ground I'm talking about as far as the United States Constitution. There are Americans standing up for their constitutional rights and expressing those explicitly. And we'll go over a couple of those speeches where you hear them, quoting constitutional wording and saying, this is not right, we need to change this. Or they're invoking constitutional rights as a means to get to their end, which is obviously the abolition of slavery. Okay, I realize I've got dogs barking in the background. I hope that's not too disturbing. I've also got birds, wild birds. I live next to a bird preserve, and so I get the most magnificent birds around here. Cardinals, bluebirds, just the most magnificent birds, little finches. But right now, they are all looking to make nests because it's springtime. But I think they're thinking they're going to fly through my window and get under some eaves somewhere. So if you hear this glass pinging going on, that's birds. They're not hurting themselves. I've noticed they're doing okay. But nevertheless, there's a few distractions today. Okay, right out of the gate here, after the writing of the U.S. Constitution, you've got Benjamin Rush saying, "For God's sake, do not exhibit a new spectacle to the world of men just emerging from a war in favor of liberty." I mean, he's looking at this condition where we have, created this remarkable governing system that's based off of the fact that all men are free. And he's saying, and we're supposed to, and we're going to have this slavery going on, this is the kind of example we're going to set. I mean, it is ridiculous, and he was good to call it out as ridiculous. Now, let's just go over a couple of vocabulary words, just in case you haven't heard them. They're not necessarily flooding the history books. Abolition, that's the act of abolishing or annulling, the abrogation of, the utter destruction, as in the abolition of laws, decrees, ordinances, rights, customs, debts, etc. We are going into law or an existing condition, and we are going to act as if it never happened. We are going to totally destroy that law. And an abolitionist, obviously, is a person who wants to stop or abolish slavery. Now, some firepower in case, you come up against these tireless efforts to trash our founding fathers. There's a lot of firepower here in members of the founding era that were absolutely against slavery and vocal about being against slavery. Okay, let's get started with this first slide. Abolitionism during the Revolutionary period of America. Okay, now you remember Benjamin Rush. We talked about him a little bit, especially when we talked about the Judeo-Christian founding of America, and the influence of that on our country and on our documents. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he also was a very strong leader for the abolitionist movement. And this movement is gaining ground. By 1780 and through 1804, several states have abolished slavery within their own state. These are states, invoking their sovereignty, their legal sovereignty to do what they please to do in their own state. We just had the discussion about the First Amendment debate and how the Supreme Court had come in and basically federalized a new interpretation of the Constitution. Well, these states are doing the exact opposite at this time. They are coming in and saying, now, if the federal government's not going to do it, we're going to do it. And in our state, this is the way we want it. We want to abolish slavery. History doesn't do these people and their effort much justice. We're going to come to the point here in history where the Supreme Court's going to overrule all this. So remember, Supreme Court justices are men too, not angels, okay? And they are capable of making poor decisions. And you're going to find out in this lesson that they made a very poor decision with regards to slavery. All right. The much demonized 3/5 compromise. Let's look at this situation again. When it came time to determine the representation for Congress, how many, they were going to base it off population, the subject of the amount of slaves in the southern slaveholding states comes up at this convention. The slaveholding states want to be able to count their slaves as full persons for the purposes of representation. Now, the purpose of doing that, not because they had in the goodness of their heart to determine that slaves were actually people, they weren't ready to do that, but for the sake of having representation in Congress, they were going to say, hey, we've got all these people down here. What does that do? Well, that's going to over-represent them in Congress. And the states that do not have slaves are saying, no way are we going to allow you to come in and make a power grab for representation in Congress. The more population count you can claim, the higher your representation in Congress is going to be, and that's a voting block. That's voting power right there in Congress. So this heated debate is going on, and it leads to a compromise. And that is the 3/5 compromise that you always hear about. The states that had abolished slavery agreed that for the purposes of counting population, male slaves would be counted as 3/5 portion. That was going to cut back on their number of representatives they were going to be able to offer to Congress based on their population. When you look back on history, it's hard to engage in what it was like to be part of that history. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this 3/5 compromise gets used in this race debate today in the most negative manner possible. It does sound horrendous, but you're pulling it totally out of context. What's being failed to be mentioned today is that the 3/5 compromise was also a fight on the abolitionist side to try to reduce the power of the slaveholding states. You've got to acknowledge that. Now, we're talking about power plays here, but still they're saying, no, we're not going to allow you to use your slavery to overpower the nation with your representation. They didn't want that because they knew in the end that was going to empower the slaveholding states to make whatever laws they wanted to in Congress because they would have had the largest voting bloc. The Three-Fifths Compromise is the first constitutional restriction on slavery. And I think that was a good effort. Probably the best they were going to get at that time. Nevertheless, it's progress. Now, when it comes to quizzes and exams, I want you constantly going back to your copy of the Constitution and looking and finding the constitutional source for these actions. Because on the test, you're allowed to bring your Constitution to the exam and refer to it. I love when I watch my students in class rifling through their papers, rifling through their Constitution to find an article in a section that I'm trying to get them to look for as an answer to a question. So there's going to be questions. And, I want you to know that on the exams, bring your Constitution with you because you can just look it up. I don't expect you to memorize the Constitution. I think that's ridiculous. But I want you to be familiar with it. So you should know approximately where to go. So where are you going to find the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution? Well, start with the fact that we're talking about representation in Congress here. Where was Congress created? Well, it's created in Article 1. So go to Article 1 and find the section where it talks about Three-Fifths Compromise. And you're going to find it in Article 1, Section 2, that third clause, that third paragraph. And obviously this was overturned by subsequent amendments. But nevertheless, that's the original documentation of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, after the turn of the century, you start to see a coalition building, and that is the abolitionists are starting to join with the women's rights movement because they have a common goal, and that is equal rights. The majority of these people were young enough to remember the Declaration of Independence, and so they can still, in their mind, rationalize what it's saying, which is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And the gender term used here is not restrictive, okay? It's common in the Bible, and it was common in these documents that men meant all people. So there are some noteworthy people in history that are starting to find their voice. And we're going to start with Sojourner Truth. Now, I think she just embodies the entire movement. She's a woman. She's a former slave, having escaped in 1826 with her infant daughter to free territory. And she became a very vocal and popular and certainly memorable participant in these movements. She even went as far as to recruit black troops into the Union Army during the Civil War. I would have loved to have met this woman. I think it would have just been an extraordinary experience to even talk to her for a short period of time. Okay, I'm going to read this speech, and it has a very heavy accent, so I'm going to do the best I can to get this right, but I think you'll get the gist of the point. Okay, it's called Ain't I a Woman? This is the name given to it. And it was an extemporaneous speech, which means she just kind of came up with it off the cuff. Okay, she must have been asked to speak at one of these rallies and just called up on the spot and spoke just off the cuff. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into a carriage or over mud puddles or gives me the best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I could have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talked about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? And someone whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you measure it full? Then that little man in the black over there says women can't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and to get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliging to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. Okay, there's just so much said here. We couldn't possibly cover it all. Even though it looks like, we have this uneducated woman speaking just, off the cuff, extemporaneously. But she says so much here. Well, first of all, she's saying, she's kind of standing up for the fact that she was strong. First of all, she was a slave working in the fields. She bore 13 children up to this point. And she's mocking the fact that men are saying women need help just getting in the carriage. She could have pulled the carriage, okay? She's saying this is ridiculous because I have worked hard. I don't need help doing daily tasks. I certainly don't need help getting up into a carriage. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that men shouldn't be chivalrous. And, that's not the point here. She's making a mockery of the delicacy they're trying to shove onto women, and then claim women don't have the brains or the power to take care of themselves. When she just, her whole life is an example of a woman against all odds, taking care of herself, even to the point of freeing herself by escaping from slavery with a baby. And then she talks about, one of the biggest arguments against abolitionism was the fact that they felt like the slaves were not intelligent enough to be citizens. Now first of all, that's just so insulting. They weren't allowed to even get an education. They didn't even have the opportunity to do so. So naturally, they're not going to, and you can tell by the words that she's using, which I think are pretty good, but because they're certainly effective. But, they don't have this opportunity, but she's saying it doesn't matter because all men are created equal. It doesn't matter whether I'm not as smart as the next person. I'm still a full person. Why wouldn't you measure that full is what she's asking. And, the crowning blow here is the man that asked, or it makes the comment that women can't have the same rights because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, first of all, that's the most ludicrous and ridiculous argument I've ever heard. I mean, talk about lacking in education. What kind of reasoning was that coming from this man? But she's saying, hey, we brought Christ into the world with God, and you didn't have anything to do with it. Okay, we're talking about the Immaculate Conception here of Mary bringing Jesus into the world with the help of God and not the help of a man. I mean, today's feminists can take a real lesson from this woman because she understood the logic here. And she was just extraordinary. She's just one of my favorites from history. And I hope she gets a lot of face time. All right, that's Sojourner Truth. And that was a name she gave herself. Her original given name was Isabella Baumfree. And I'm sure that Baumfree was her slaveholder's family name. All right, so let's move on to William Lloyd Garrison. He was certainly an abolitionist, and he created a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831. And so he's helping to promote this idea through the media. He was also part of the 1832 New England Anti-Slavery Society, and he was a supporter of the women's suffrage movement as well. Then, you're probably familiar with Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery in 1838, and he was mentored by Garrison. And Douglass created his own paper called the North Star, and what a great name. You just got to think back. I love when names mean so much. And that guiding North Star, I'm sure that's what was going through his mind when he named this paper. Okay, he became an extraordinary orator, and he used his voice through the Civil War. He was also a supporter of women's rights. So you have two efforts here coming together and making a very strong voice together. Now, this topic of territorial jurisdiction, who has it, who can control it, I think this is one of the most misunderstood and underrepresented arguments in the abolitionist slavery debate, especially when it comes to efforts made by people to end slavery. And I don't think it's taught very well, so I'm going to do my best to convey this message to you. Now, at this time, you have the states, some that are slaves, some that are slave states, some that are free states, and you have some of the territories that have been acquired by the United States. Now, the map over there isn't really a good representation because obviously it has other states in there that are delineated. So it's for demonstration purposes only and not necessarily historically accurate as far as this time period. We're going to start with a constitutional fact. Who had jurisdiction over the activities of the territories? According to the Constitution, who does? Let's go to the Constitution. Okay, you've got to go to Article 4, Section 3 to find this. And I'm going to read it. New states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor in any state be formed by the junction of two or more states, or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as the Congress. Okay, we're acknowledging some state sovereignty here. You can't just jack around the state borders and create whatever you want. The states had a right, those states involved had a right to come in and, be part of this process if that was going to happen. Now, the second part of this is what we're trying to get to, because this first part is going to come up later in the slide, but this second part is what we're talking about right now. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or any particular state. Okay, you heard it right there. Who has power over the territories? Congress does. Okay, they have the power to make all needful rules and regulations, and they are going to utilize this part of the Constitution to start an abolitionist movement in those territories. This becomes a very heated discussion and is primarily one of the biggest topics of debate between Lincoln and Douglas. Because Douglas thought that the territories should have some autonomy, should have some sovereignty in this manner, and he was pushing for that. He wanted the territories to have the sovereignty to declare that their area was going to be slave-holding territory. But the Congress was holding back on those reins, trying to hold on to this abolitionist movement and saying, no, we're saying that in the territories there will be no slavery. All right, we're building up to the Dred Scott case, okay, where there's going to be a ruling by the Supreme Court. But there are several factors at play here, and so here's my second bit of information. Once free, always free doctrine. In the territory, and it is still a territory at this time, the Missouri Territorial Statute, the laws and the courts in this territory upheld the once free, always free doctrine. And what is that? That meant that if a slave was taken out of the territory, out of Missouri's territory, and they were taken into a free state and resided there with their master, and the master brought the slave back into slave territory, that slave was considered free. Essentially, what this doctrine was trying to promote was the freeing of slaves, because if you are going to take your slave into and set down and reside on free soil, you can't come back into the territory of Missouri and say, okay, now he's a slave again. That doesn't work. Essentially, you freed that slave when you crossed into that free soil area. So do you see how there are things going on under the bigger banner of history that were efforts to free these slaves? As you start noticing these little undercurrents of activity, I want you to keep that in mind if you're someone who goes and tries and you're involved in an effort, a political effort to change something about America that you don't like. Let's just use, for example, the right to life, anti-abortion activists. I think it's very important to understand that you can't, when something is this ingrained and this entrenched in our society, you're not going to be able to rip it out. It's like going to try to rip a tree out with all the roots. It's just not going to happen. You've got to go in and be satisfied with small victories that are eventually going to get you where you want to go. Because all throughout history, that's how things happened. Someone pulled, one root out, and then someone's going to pull another root out, and eventually that tree is going to be extracted from the land. But it doesn't happen all in one swoop. Okay? So understand that it took so long for slavery to be abolished. But look at the effort that was given by all these activists and these rulings like this doctrine. There were people making good faith efforts, and there were people getting victories under these efforts. So just keep that in mind. Don't get frustrated. You are not the be all end all to the victory of an effort. You're part of the effort, and it's not going to necessarily happen overnight. Be patient. God is with you, and He will get you. He will have victory in His own time. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Missouri Compromise. Here's another struggle, and it has this name that has been slandered many times. Nevertheless, we're going to talk about it. We're going to get down to the real facts here. This is 1820, and there is rife in Congress again. They are on the border of maybe losing their abolitionist majority. And so what's going to happen here is Missouri's going to become a state. Okay, some of these territories are going to be incorporated as states by Congress. But what happened was Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state in an effort to compromise, because they're losing power here, and so they're pretty much under pressure, and they're going to have to admit them as a slave state. But what they do is at the same time they admit Maine as a free state, because they're trying to maintain balance in this representational power. So nevertheless, this is how the compromise goes down. And also what they do is they're saying, okay, Missouri's going to be a slave state, but we are going to prohibit slavery in all the rest of the Louisiana Territory. They literally draw a line in the dirt, okay? And what they do is they say all Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 latitude line will be free soil. No slavery up there. But what's going to happen is everything below that is going to be allowed to have slavery is going to be legal in that part of the territory. That's the compromise. That's the Missouri Compromise up to this point, okay? This is where we are in history. So keep that in mind. You've got Congress has territorial jurisdiction, and they just exercised it. You have the once free, always free doctrine going on in Missouri. And then you've got this territory that's above this certain line in the United States that Congress is utilizing their strength and saying it will be free soil, but they're allowing only the state of Missouri in that area to be a slave state. All right, continuing on. Now, in the state of Missouri, in 1824, after this compromise, they codify the once free, always free doctrine. In other words, it's not just a statute that was upheld by some of the courts in that area anymore. Now it's state law. And that should start to justify in your mind what I was just telling you about your efforts. Okay, regardless of the fact that Missouri was going to be a slave state, there were people in there saying, not on my watch, not in my court. We're still going to have this once free, always free doctrine. As a matter of fact, we're going to make it state law. So if you take your slaves out of our state and you take them onto free soil and reside there, if you come back over here, those slaves are free now. If in our state, they're going to be free. So do you see the struggle going on here? You don't always see that in the top level distribution of history, American history. But here's another somebody taking a stand, okay? And this happened in the courts, and this is going to set up a case that's going to come before the United States Supreme Court, and it's going to involve this once free, always free doctrine that has now become state law. All right, let's move on to the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857. Okay, obviously this is happening. This case is being heard shortly before the Civil War. Now, of course, they don't know the Civil War is about to start, but you can see how this is a very infamous decision because it's going to be ruled in the favor of the slaveholder and not of the slave. And so basically the Supreme Court is going to uphold slavery in this decision. And obviously it becomes the spark that kind of lights the gunpowder for the Civil War. Now, I realize there's a lot of different components to this. There's a great History Channel video, and I'm going to post the link to it, that you can watch to kind of reinforce all these little details, because there's a lot going on here, and so sometimes it's kind of hard to follow the map. Okay, Dred Scott, born in 1799, died in 1858. He was a slave, and he was sold to a different owner who took Dred Scott to a free state. And then that same owner brought Dred Scott into Missouri. Now, Missouri is a slave state, but it had the once free, always free doctrine that was now state law. And Dred Scott knew this. So he, on behalf of him and his wife, sued the owner for his own freedom because he knew the law. And of course, this became challenged and went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hears the case and hands down a ruling in favor of Dred Scott's owner, effectively denying him his freedom, saying that the once free, always free doctrine was not going to be upheld. And also, what this effectively did was invalidate the Missouri Compromise, because the Supreme Court was claiming that that compromise was unconstitutional because they were going to say Congress did not have the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Well, it did have authority to prohibit slavery in the territories because we just read the territorial jurisdiction they had in Article 4, Section 3. So, really bad ruling here. Probably this is what woke up Lincoln, and brought him to this firefight with one heck of a armory. And look at the timing here. You got over 10 years. It was brought to the circuit court in 1846, and the ruling was in 1857. So we've got like 11 years, that this slave is having to go through these court battles. And he ends up dying the next year. Interestingly enough, on Constitution Day, September 17th, 1858. I always think numbers have a lot of meaning too. And 17, well, first of all, the 9th month, 9 is justice. Biblically, 9 is justice. And 17 is victory. So Dred Scott may not have seen in his lifetime the victory, but he's going to get it. He's not going to be here for it, but eventually his efforts are going to be victorious, because the sacrifice he makes here is going to launch a civil war. We are going to have literally brothers and fathers, cousins fighting each other over slavery. Okay, I posted that video, and I would suggest you take a look at it because it really helps. You really need to remember these things, like about the Missouri Compromise and the once free, always free doctrine. And this video is good for kind of going over that roadmap, kind of showing you how that happened. All right, next slide. Now we're going to be talking about, now we finally have reached the American Civil War, and look at that date, 1858, the year that Dred Scott dies. And what is Lincoln doing? Lincoln and Douglas are vying for a senatorial seat, and Lincoln challenges Douglas to a series of debates. Just a little offshoot here. If you're in debate, or you've heard of this term Lincoln-Douglas debates, that means that there's going to be a one-on-one debate. And it came from this event where Lincoln challenged Douglas to debates, and they had this one-on-one debate. Sometimes in UIL, they'll have a type of debate that you can participate in, and it's called a Lincoln-Douglas debate, because it's one person debating one other person. I mean, sometimes you have like group debates or congressional debates. So it's just a category of debating. All right, in that debate, Douglas is accusing Lincoln of extremism. Douglas feels like the territories should have the autonomy and the sovereignty to determine whether they will be slave holders or not. Now, I'm sure he's basing this argument off the Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott case, because he's got some validity there. If you're taking into consideration that you feel like the Supreme Court can overrule constitutional law. They basically did the same thing when we just talked about the First Amendment and religious rights. They redefined what it meant, what the Establishment Clause meant. And here with slavery, they essentially did the same thing by overruling who had jurisdiction over the territories. Now, these debates become a windfall decision for Lincoln because basically what he set up is a war of ideas between him and Douglas. And I think effectively he wins. He was very skilled and very educated, especially biblically educated. And he used several times this Matthew 12:22-28 verse that says, a house divided cannot stand. Okay, and a house divided being a home. If you have division in a home, the house of cards is going to fall apart. Okay, that family is going to fall apart. And Lincoln's making this same statement about the nation. He's saying we cannot be divided like this. We're not going to survive as a nation. And I think this is what develops his passion for preserving the Union. He does not want slavery to become the issue that destroys America. And it appears to me that his heavy dependence on biblical scripture really is how he wins this war of ideas and becomes president. He is resonating with the people. Okay, he is using the logic that comes right out of the Bible, and he is winning this war literally with words. All right, in 1860, Lincoln is elected president. Those words obviously went a long way. He's elected president, and this becomes the first victory for the newly created Republican Party. But the South decides they're out of here. So the South secedes. And in 1861, Congress declares war on the South. Because remember, if you look in here's another constitutional moment. If you look in the Constitution, the South, the states could not make a confederacy together. They could not separate out and join together against the Union. That was just unconstitutional. So secession is basically unconstitutional. If you're going to secede, just know in your mind that you are declaring war on the United States. So I know a lot of people go around wanting, the South to secede again or Texas to secede again. But really, I don't have any desire to go to war with the rest of the United States. It's better off that you as a state show yourself as an example of strength to the rest of the United States in a different manner other than seceding. Okay, you're going to get a lot more done if you work that way. And I just don't think any of them are going to be better off as their own state. So regardless, the southern states do secede and Congress declares war against them. So now we have the Civil War. And in 1863, Lincoln declares an executive order that all slaves should be set free. And this, of course, is called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, you have probably all these things from history, so I'm not going to just beat this dead horse. But I am going to walk you through this logically and from a constitutional perspective of what Lincoln was doing. Lincoln, what founding document did Lincoln obviously know and understand? The Declaration of Independence. And what does it say? All men are created equal. Okay, so he's already got a basis for which to start, and that is the Declaration of Independence. And then, as president, he's going to execute this law that we know. This is natural law, and we're going to execute the natural law. And he has that ability in Article 2, Section 1, the vesting clause. The vesting clause empowers the president with executive power. Okay? He is there to enforce the laws. All right, now go down to Section 3, the last part of Article 2, Section 3, where it says this, and this is known as the Take Care Clause. The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Lincoln knows he's got the constitutional upper hand here, and this gives him that confidence he needs to make it through this Civil War. And once he gets deep into this battle and the Union is at a low point in this Civil War, he delivers the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, of course, the Union's going to go on to win the war, and the 13th Amendment is the amendment that officially abolishes slavery. And in 1865, Lincoln's second inaugural address. Now, I'm not going to read the whole speech. I just want to draw your attention to one particular part of it. Lincoln has already stated, we drug ourselves into this war, essentially, but he's going to make the case for the Union. And he's already declared this whole thing was unconstitutional from the beginning. But nevertheless, we faced it, and now we're done. But he wants to stress, and he does so in this speech, that this was a constitutional, effort made by the Union. And he states that, quote, "These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war. While the government, being the national government, the federal government, claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it being slavery. The federal government had the constitutional power to do so, but it was not honored. That constitutional power was not honored and was challenged by the court." Okay, abolitionism and the Civil War. We just covered that whole topic. This last slide, I just want to kind of raise your attention about how this all can be applied in today's world and what you're seeing today. Are we really racially divided I mean, considering, is there really a problem of racism in this country? I just ask you to kind of examine that in your own mind. Are we going to kneel at the game, or are we not going to kneel at the game? Why can Tim Tebow kneel in prayer at the game, but it's not looked upon favorably, or it's shunned? But players can kneel at a game during the national anthem, and it's praised and held up and regarded as a noble action. So who's right here? Are we allowed to kneel in protest, but not allowed to kneel in prayer? And also, we've got a public-private issue going on here. And what are the constitutional facts about that? Okay, if you work for someone, they call the shots. Okay, they're allowed, you are representing them. So I guess the NFL is allowing their players to kneel in protest. Okay, but I do believe the free market will win out this decision, because it'll all depend on what the fans are going to tolerate. If you're not going to tolerate watching the football players kneel at the football game, and you're not going to go to the game, or you're not going to watch the game, that's going to hurt the NFL. Okay, so that's going to be a free market decision, basically. And what about these high school students kneeling during school? Now, you're on public property, basically. So what are their rights? And what are their obligations? I don't know. There's a lot to kick around here, and I'm not doing it today, but it is something to think about. But history can be a good proving ground for our constitutional rights. And I think that you should take these episodes in history where we have made mistakes and corrected those mistakes and applied them to what's happening today. Use that, draw on that power, that constitutional power, because God knows we need to do that. We need to start drawing on the Constitution and not just drawing on emotion. Okay, I'm done for today. The birds are quiet, the dogs are sleeping, and I guess I bored them all to death because they're all gone. No more birds trying to get into the house. And the dogs are out there sleeping like little sweet puppies. Okay. All right, y'all have a great rest of the day. It's a beautiful spring day here, a little wet, but a beautiful spring today, and I'm going to go enjoy my day. So I want you guys to do the same, and we will join together again in government class here at GW Bridge Academy, and I look forward to that. See you next time.